It's getting brisk. You feel that? You know what that is? That's the Cold War, baby. The Cold War. That's right. This is a rivalry, or a conflict, that lasted for over 45 years between two of the world's biggest superpowers. The essential question we'll be asking here is, how did the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union shape the world in the years after World War II? The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the superpowers, and they then became enemies. Now this goes back actually to World War II. At the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, this is in the Soviet Union, and we see the three leaders of the powerful Allied countries meeting together to discuss what they're going to do with Germany once the war is over. We've got Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. You've got Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States. And you've got Joseph Stalin, the leader, the authoritarian dictator of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. And the three of them get together to decide how they're going to handle Germany once the war is over. Now, when you look at this photograph, do you think that the United States and the Soviet Union saw each other as allies or enemies when this photo was taken? Yeah, I mean, they're smiling, they look like they're getting along, they've got a common enemy, a common goal. Looks like they're allies when this photo is taken. And when the war ends, World War II, in April of 1945, at least in the European theater, the American soldiers and the Soviet soldiers had been closing in on Germany from the east and the west. And they met in the middle at the Elbe River, and you can see they're shaking hands here. They're definitely allies at this moment. So when the war is over, Germany is divided up into 4 regions, or territories. And the Allied powers, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and the United States, split Germany up into 4 regions, and they get to govern each one how they want. Now, the democratic countries of the United States, France, and Great Britain, they get to have the west side of Germany. While the Soviet Union gets to control and govern the eastern part of Germany. They even divided up the capital city of Berlin into 4 regions where those 4 countries could then govern them. Alright, so that's Germany after World War II. Now we go into the early 50s, the early 1950s, and I want you to look at this American political cartoon. You could also call it propaganda. I want you to examine it and decide whether you think, or what you think about it. Now let's look closely at that face there. Who is this man? Where have you seen this face before? Oh yeah, that's Joseph Stalin. Yeah, right, the leader of the Soviet Union. So this poster says how communism works. What does the octopus then represent? You got it, communism. Do you think this cartoon reflects it in a positive or negative view? If you said negative, you'd be correct. So how can you tell? Well, you've got this large, infuriating looking, or furious looking kind of octopus. He's all dark red. He's reaching its tentacles around the world. He's got that angry looking face. You can see the hammer and the sickle on his body there. We'll come back and talk about that later. And it says how communism works. So do you think that the United States and the Soviet Union saw each other as allies or enemies when this cartoon was created? Yeah, if you said enemies, you'd be right. Okay? So how do these images reflect, or what do these images reflect about how the United States and the Soviet Union felt about each other? We went from this smiling, happy group to then this kind of propaganda. Now, if I'd shown you this image at the beginning, you might have thought that they were enemies in the first place because they're not smiling, right? Okay. So, the United States and the Soviet Union, they emerged from World War II as 2 of the most powerful countries in the world. Now, although during the war the 2 nations had cooperated as allies with a shared enemy, Germany, the United States and the Soviet Union quickly become bitter rivals. All right. Now, 2 new alliances soon develop, one led by the United States and one led by the Soviet Union. And the competition between these 2 superpowers creates a world in which many nations took either the side of the United States or the Soviet Union. You can see in this map, it's called Soviet influence in Europe, post-World War II, how the Soviet Union is expanding across Europe. The tensions then increase between these 2 alliances when the dictator of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, seized control of several Eastern European countries. They're the ones that are all colorful there on the eastern or the right side. This is in 1945. The people in these nations, they were denied the freedom to choose their own governments, to travel freely, to even speak freely. That's how the communist government was working. Now you see Joseph Stalin twirling his wicked-looking mustache there, and you see Winston Churchill in his bow tie and bald head, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And Stalin's takeover of these countries alarmed leaders in the United States and in Western Europe. The former Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, he warned, quote, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent. In the view of Western democracies, that iron curtain divided the free world of the West from the Soviet-dominated world of the East." And the United States the United States, Great Britain, France, they were fearful of Joseph Stalin, who was known to be a ruthless dictator that some historians estimate had killed between 20 and 30 million people in his own country. He was a very authoritarian leader. This map here shows you how those communist countries that communist country was expanding across the east. And then you see that yellow squiggly line right down the middle. That's the Iron Curtain. Now, it's not a physical wall or a physical barrier, but it's more of an imaginary line that divides the Western democracies from the Eastern communist countries. Now, this rivalry between those two sides led to what's called the Cold War. And it was called a Cold War not because they fought each other. In fact, they didn't. The United States and the Soviet Union engaged in intense military competition without ever fighting each other directly. They did not fight each other in a war. It was cold because of the icy tension between the two, the building up of militaries that could easily have fought with each other. So this rivalry between the Western democracies and the Communist Soviet Union is the Cold War. So democracies are a government by the people. It's a majority rule. You get to vote. You get to vote for your leaders. Communism is an economic system that's based on the idea that farmers and businesses, that they should be owned in common by the workers who do the labor. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a really nice idea, right? Everybody works together, they produce things together, then they share everything, and there's no rich and no poor. On the surface, it does sound good, but there's a kind of a rotten underbelly about communism. We'll come back to that in a moment. All right, one more piece of propaganda. It's from 1951. On the top it says, "Stop Communism." You've got a man standing in the Philippines, which is an island country in Southeast Asia, and he's got a sword in his hand. What does that sword say? Democracy. And you can see that he's fighting off that hammer and sickle. There it is again. So he's stopping communism with the sword of democracy. And many Americans viewed the Cold War as a conflict between good and evil. Which side would Americans say was evil? You got it. Communism. So let's now find out what those two mean. Democracy is a form of government, and capitalism is a form of economy, money. Democracy means that people have a voice in their government. They get to choose who is going to be leading them. They have freedom. Capitalism is when individual people like you and like me, we can start our own businesses, and we own the businesses and the farms and whatever. We can become entrepreneurs. You can decide if you want to start a business, make your own money, hire people, fire people, sell your business if you want to, or get a new job. That's democracy and capitalism. Communism is what they had in the Soviet Union. Communism is more of a system of government and economy. See, this is where farms and businesses were to be owned by the workers / the government, because the government ended up taking control of those farms and businesses. And the workers would produce, the government would take, and then divide out the profits equally. Now, it was equally poor. So the workers were equally given a low amount of the profits or of the goods that were created. There was no rich, there was no poor, there was just poor. There was just everybody being poor. All right. Now, the hammer and the sickle there, it represents the workers and the farmers. The hammer is for building and construction, and the sickle is representing a farm tool. It's a curved blade that you can cut down crops, wheat, that kind of thing. Now, on the bottom there is a Soviet propaganda, right? You see this heroic-looking man and woman holding up the hammer and the sickle and the wheat that has just been harvested. And the man is holding in his hand an atom. and that represents science and technology. And so there was a lot of people that supported communism. There was a lot of people that were opposed to communism. And there was a lot of people that wanted to get out of those communist countries. They wanted their freedom. And the United States wanted to stop communism from spreading. They had already seen it spread this far across Eastern Europe, and the President of the United States, Harry Truman, he wanted to make sure it didn't spread any further. Now, Truman was the president at the end of World War II. Remember, he's the one that decided to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. He didn't want a war with the Soviet Union. He realized that could be a world-ending kind of war. So he decided instead to try to stop the spread of communism. The policy of containment is trying to contain communism, keep it where it is. You've heard of a container before, right? A shipping container or a container of yogurt or a container of orange juice. It keeps everything together, the container does. So the policy of containment was an attempt to stop the spread of communism into more countries. And that policy of containment continues on this conflict of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union is trying to expand communism, and the United States is trying to contain it. I mentioned that the Cold War didn't have the United States and the Soviet Union fight each other directly. Instead, they fought proxy wars. We'll talk more about those. But a proxy war is when both the United States and the Soviet Union support another country and have those countries fight against each other. It's kind of like they've got these countries back. They help them fight against each other. But the United States and the Soviet Union do not engage directly. All right, that is the Cold War. We'll talk more about it. Everybody, even though it's heating up, I'm getting cold. Stay warm, everybody.